Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the podcast. Now, first off, my apologies for being a few days late with this episode. The reason is that I was very much preoccupied last week with republishing my heavy bag book. That took up all of my time, and normally I would have finished the episode for last Friday, but again, with the relaunch of that book, I was pretty much all over the place getting that done, and couldn't really finish this episode in time. So that's why it's a few days late. Now, that said, if you want to check out the book, go to wimdemeere.com/heavybag. So my name, wimdemeere.com/heavybag. That takes you to the resources page. So if you don't have the book yet, you can find the links to get it there, both paper and electronic version, obviously. You can also see the video that I made with Paladin Press. There's a link there if you want to buy that one. And most of all, if you already own the book, that's the resources page that I made with a bunch of videos of me training on the heavy bag, links to all kinds of equipment, different kinds of heavy bag, how to hang it, and a lot of stuff that you can basically use to bring the content of the book to life. So that was my goal with that page, and I hope you guys can enjoy all the information that's there. So that was a quick announcement, and we will now get back to the interview. Thanks, and I'll talk to you next time. Hi everybody, and welcome to the podcast. And today's guest is another friend of mine. As you guys know, I like to invite people with very specific experience and knowledge. So I interviewed a friend of mine, Captain Jon Lupo. John, how are you doing?
I'm well, Wim. Thank you. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Very happy to have you here. I've actually invited you for the podcast a while ago, but I'm very glad that we finally got to do it.
Life does get in the way, doesn't it?
It does indeed. So for the people who obviously haven't heard from you yet, because you're not a huge martial arts celebrity or self-defense guy, could you give a little bit of an information about what's your background in law enforcement, maybe some of your training or martial arts, combatives, otherwise, just a general idea of what you've been up to?
Sure. First and foremost, I guess I've been a member of the New York State Police in the United States since 1985. So I'm coming up on my 32-year anniversary. I presently hold the rank of captain, and I work in a unit that we call the Professional Standards Bureau, but which most people would understand better as Internal Affairs. In the course of that career, I've been on road patrol, actually out taking calls on patrol. I have worked executive protection. I've worked on the security detail for past governor and First Family. I've been an instructor at our state police academy in northeastern New York. I spent some time as a public information officer at headquarters. I've really done a little bit of everything. I've been a program and a grant administrator. I've worked in the field as a supervisor, and I've worked a few special details along the way. As far as my combatives or martial arts background, I've dipped my toe in a lot of different pools over the years. I started with judo back when I was 11 or 12 years old, and boxed all the way through high school and part of college. I've had some training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Shotokan, Shorin-ji-ryu, and most recently, which is to say the last 8 or 10 years, I've focused more on combatives under the umbrella of World War II combatives and some Krav Maga. In fact, I'm searching for a local Krav Maga school as we speak. So, what else can I tell you?
No, that's quite a how do you say that? Quite the varied backgrounds, for both professionally speaking, doing all sorts of different aspects of the job, and also martial arts wise, you've been practicing for a long time. Would you say that's very common in law enforcement? In when you look at the officers that that there's such an emphasis on training in martial arts and self-defense systems?
I would say I wouldn't say prevalent. That's not the word I would use. We're all trained in the defensive tactics that we're expected to have to employ as members of the state police, and I would say the majority of the people on my job that I've known over the years have continued their training in some way. If not in martial arts, or if not in self-defense, then certainly in other physical disciplines, whether it's weight training or aerobic versus anaerobic training. I would say most of the people that I've met over the years have worked to maintain some level of fitness, just to make the day-to-day fulfillment of their duties a little bit more effective.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and speaking of, could you talk a little bit about what the job of a state trooper is actually like? Because, like we talked before we start recording, I live in Belgium, and many of my listeners are not from the U.S. So the different types of law enforcement agencies are perhaps not clear. So how is the job of a state trooper different from, let's say, a sheriff or a law enforcement officer, police officer in New York City, maybe? Just a little bit of a sketch of what that actually entails.
Sure. In New York State, which is one of the 50, obviously, one of the 50 United States, there are law enforcement officers representing just about every level of government, from federal to state, which is the category that I would fall under, to municipal. So there are federal law enforcement agencies, state law enforcement agencies, such as the state police and our state Office of Environmental Conservation. But there are also municipal agencies, including county sheriff's departments, as you mentioned, and also police departments in cities, many towns, and many villages. So there's a fair amount of overlap in most areas of New York State. And while the officers in those representing those various levels of government have similar powers, their missions may vary based on the mission of the agency that they work for, the local political scene, the local economic picture. For example, my jurisdiction as a member of the state police is under the law is anywhere in New York State. But if I'm working in an area where I have a large city, say New York City obviously has its own police department. So, and it's very large. It's in excess of 40,000 members, and the state police right now is a little over 5,000 sworn, I would say. So because New York City has its own police department, we wouldn't have primary jurisdiction there. We could work in New York City if we were invited to, if we had some kind of an agreement or a contract with the NYPD, but that wouldn't be our primary jurisdiction. On the other hand, in the more rural areas of New York State, for example, up in what we call the Adirondack region, which is more toward New York State's border with Canada, there are very few large cities, almost none, in fact. So there are going to be areas where the only available law enforcement response will come from possibly the New York State Police, or possibly the local sheriff's department, or perhaps one of the smaller towns or villages that has its own police agency. So while we all enforce the law in one way or another, and while there is some overlap depending on what region of New York State you're in, the jurisdictional lines tend to be pretty clearly drawn, so that there's no duplication of services, and so that the local population gets the most bang for its buck. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense, and I think that might clear things up for many of the listeners who are not familiar with the way everything works in the US as far as law enforcement is concerned. Because it gets quite confusing, I think, sometimes when just simply watching where most people get obviously their information, watching TV series and movies, and there's a sheriff, and then there's a police department, police officer shows up, and then there's a trooper, and then there's an FBI agent, and it's like, okay, what's going on here? So that's what I wanted to clear up a little bit. Could you Could you just maybe talk a little bit about what is an average day for a state trooper like? What's like an average shift, if anything, if that exists? What's the job like on a day-to-day level?
It's tough to capsulize in one or two words. I can say, we're primarily a rural police force. While we do have a presence in all of the major cities in New York State, the job of the quote-unquote average trooper tends to be spent mostly in rural areas, and it's a very varied existence for a state trooper. Our agency's missions include preserving and enforcing highway safety. We try to promote peace and order. We investigate all manner of complaints and cases, including domestic incidents, missing children cases, assaults, burglaries, robberies, homicides. State troopers, well, let me backtrack for a second. The state police, we divide our sworn personnel into two major categories or divisions. On the one side is what we call our uniform force, and that's what most people, I think of when they think of a state trooper. They think of a trooper in uniform. And then on the other side, we have what we call our Bureau of Criminal Investigation. And these are what most people, these folks are what most people think of when they think of detectives. They're in plain clothes. They investigate more serious crimes. They conduct investigations that may take a matter of weeks, months, even years, depending on the case. Whereas troopers, we're kind of the first responders. When a call comes in, when a 911 call comes in, or another, a telephonic complaint comes in, we're the first ones there, and so we have to, depending on the incident, we have to hold down that scene. We have to try to make sure everybody is as safe as possible. We have to determine if a crime has been committed. We have to determine if emergency services, whether it's fire or ambulance, should also be on the scene. We have to make decisions about what other agencies might have to be at an incident, especially if it's a larger scale incident, like an active shooter or a major fire. So, a trooper, especially in New York State, if you're working in a rural area, your nearest backup may not be right around the corner as it might be in a city, for example. So troopers are trained right from their first week in the academy that you need to be able to keep your wits about you and handle these calls, because you may be the only law enforcement presence there for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, depending on the time of year and the location, more than an hour. And it's something that really needs to be driven into a recruit trooper's skull, because if you're the only game in town and people are looking at you to be the authority, to make things right, so to speak, you better be ready to do that.
Yeah, and this is something that I want to emphasize for the listeners who aren't from the U.S. who haven't traveled there a lot. The U.S. is a pretty huge country, and there are a lot of places that are extremely rural, where there's, for miles and miles on end, there's nothing. There's no emergency services. There's no hospital. There's just vast stretches of land. Some very hospitable, in other parts not so much. And if something happens, well, guys like you, the state troopers, it takes a while before they can get there. It's not the same thing like living in a big city, like you said, in New York City itself. That's a completely different environment, and so I can imagine that the types of crimes and incidents that you see as a state trooper than in a rural area is a little bit different as well, on average. Could you talk a little bit about that? Yeah,
I think that. When I think of the differences between our job as a rural police force, and much of what I say also applies to the county sheriff's offices that I mentioned earlier, as opposed to a city police department, the the first difference that leaps to mind is the sheer volume of calls. A city cop, a city police officer is going to have to handle a much larger volume of calls typically. I mean, there are exceptions, but by and large, a city cop is going to see more calls because they are serving a much more densely populated area. Yeah. So in a perfect world, a police department is going to be able to hire enough officers to effectively service the number of people that they're tasked with policing. A rural agency like mine, a typical trooper is not going to field nearly as many calls as a city cop will, but because of where we work, rural versus populated, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about being the only game in town on a lot of calls. Your nearest backup may not be close by as, or not as close as it would be in a city. The kinds of calls that we handle, I can't speak with as much experience on that, only because I've never been a city cop. I can tell you that city cops they're dealing. I should say we both deal with a lot of the same types of calls. We both handle 911 emergencies. We both handle burglaries, traffic accidents, domestic incidents, missing children cases. But because of the geography and because of the way we're trained in our respective academies, even though we're enforcing the same laws, we might have to take different tacks when it comes to investigating a crime.
Yeah, and just as a quick sidetrack here, I mentioned this before to the listeners, I think, but I visited a part of the U.S. a couple of years ago, which is called the Lost Coast, which is in Northern California, and there's a really nice place called Shelter Cove. If you go there, it's really nice to be there. And I'll put a link in the show notes for everybody on Google Maps, and we talked to the people there. It's a really small town. I think there's maybe like a few hundred people max. But then I'd like you to zoom out and try to find the closest city. Good luck with that. And just look for the closest hospital or anything, basically. And there's people living there every day. And if anything happens, doesn't even have to be a spectacular crime, but something happens and emergency services need to come, whether it's an EMT or a trooper or a sheriff or whoever, it's going to take a while. It's just going to take a while, and it's very different from a 911 call in a big city, like you said, where with tens of thousands of police officers on call throughout the day. This is going to be a very different experience.
Years ago, decades ago, it might not have been as daunting a prospect of being in an isolated area like that and having to worry about something happening that would require the presence of the police or even other emergency services, but times have changed and they continue to change. And over time, I've heard a number of citizens in the rural areas of the state lament the fact that life isn't what it used to be. I mean, I've had farmers tell me that when I had to interview them, because there was a suspected, not a crack house, but a suspected drug operation going on right down the road, in literally the middle of nowhere. Yeah. And that was something that even 10, 15 years ago, they never would have even dreamed of, much of less 50 years ago. But the point is that there really are very few places, and regrettably, Shelter Cove is probably one of them, where the peace, the idyllic past is now a thing of the past, and there's really no place to go anymore where there's not going to be some kind of need for a police response.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree with that. And changing subjects a little bit or branching out on that, you mentioned before we recorded, we talked a little bit, and I mentioned, calls that involved self-defense, and you mentioned that a lot of the calls that you got when there was fighting, it was more two guys for whatever reason, going at it, and more of a dust up or a brawl as opposed to pure cases of self-defense. And I think that's really an interesting topic, because one of the things that I do on my Patreon page is violence analysis. So taking footage, whether it's cell phone, CCTV, or whatever, from incidents that happen of all kinds. And a lot of people look at that and often think, well, this is clearly self-defense. And where I see, well, no, not at all. This is two people getting into an argument and deciding to fight. That's very different from self-defense. So could you maybe talk a little bit about some examples of calls you had that you would call like a fight, two guys going at it, and what that's like for you as a law enforcement officer when you arrive? Okay, what happens? What do you do? What happens then?
Sure. And let me preface this by saying that I think the information that you're putting out to your audience regarding self-defense as a general topic of discussion, and then getting into specific areas of self-defense and the use of force, I think that's commendable, and I think it's necessary. There are, I think the vast majority of people, and perhaps you can back me up on this, the vast majority of people fortunately have never had to taste firsthand that kind of violence, that kind of a violent situation. And consequently, I mean, even though that is a good thing in and of itself, it does give rise to a lot of misconceptions about the use of force and a lot of misconceptions about self-defense, because these people, this majority of people who have not had personal firsthand experience with violence get their information about violence, if you can call it information. They get their misinformation, perhaps that's the better word, about self-defense and about violence from the media. And we need people like you, putting the word out there that not only are you only seeing one dimension, the media's representation of what violence is, but in a lot of cases you're seeing a like cop shows, for example, and I don't watch any of them, so I'm not an authority on content at this point, but I do know from what I've seen over the years that if you want to find out what it's like to be a police officer, if you want to find out what it's like to be in a violent situation, the last thing you should do is watch a primetime show that purports to be about what it's like to be a cop or what it's like to be in that situation. It's one-dimensional, it's incomplete, and it's intended to entertain. It's not intended to educate.
Exactly. Yeah, so. And I think you really hit the nail on the head there, in that nowadays there's fortunately fewer and fewer people who do get involved in the violence or who do have personal experience. And as a result, they don't really know what it's like. And it always reminds me of, and I'll see if I can find the link and put it in the show notes, but there's a professor, I think it was MIT, he's from Holland, and he would teach these amazing lectures on physics. And there's one of them I forget which law he was illustrating, but he takes the wheel of a bike, and he spins it up with a motor, and it goes really fast, and then he attaches it to this hook that is hanging from a cable, and it starts rotating. And he says, when you look at it and you say, look, I'm going to hang this very heavy wheel here on this small hook here, and you would instinctively say that that's going to fall. The angle is wrong. It cannot be attached. And then he says, well, if I spin it fast enough, it's actually going to hang just fine and just make circles. And he clearly says at one point, none of this is intuitive. And I think that's one of the key phrases when it comes to physics, but obviously violence. A lot of the things that you know from experience and that I try to talk about in the podcast and with my books and articles is that a lot of the things people think about violence when they do not have the experience of facing it, it's not intuitive.
No,
it is not intuitive at all. One of the classics, and I just put this on my blog post. I did a a bunch of free videos for my celebration of 1 year on Patreon, and one of it was an incident of a police officer in Iran shooting a bank robber in the leg, and that's one of the first things you hear when police officers use lethal force. Why didn't he shoot him in the leg? Well, the guy bleeds out. Turns out there's arteries there as well, and it's one of many reasons why it might sound intuitive to shoot for the leg as opposed to center mass or anything else, but that doesn't necessarily make it a good idea. So no. I'm in full agreement with you. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and people fortunately lack the experience. But yeah, that doesn't help obviously if you have to explain it.
Well, getting back to your question about the fights, I mean, there are a couple that leap to mind that I think will illustrate that point. I remember, and this was much more toward the beginning of my career. This is going back at least 25 years, but it's a fight that sticks out in my mind just because of I remember what an impression it made on me as a young trooper. And I came on the state police later than a lot of people, later than a lot of troopers do. I became a trooper when I was 26, and a lot of our troopers then and now are coming to this job. They're applying for this job right out of school, so they're substantially younger, 21, 22, and so on. But I remember going to this, I went to this fight call in upstate New York and in the Adirondack region, and it was that situation that I mentioned earlier where it's a rural area. It's a small village. The village did have its own police department, but they were a part-time police department. So when I was called to this bar at about 11 o'clock at night, I was the only game in town. The village PD wasn't working. They weren't due to come on until I think 7 the next morning. So long story short, I go to this bar fight, and it sounds like it's all hands, Donnybrook, a lot of people throwing punches. Well, it was reported that was actually not the case. When I got there, it was essentially two combatives. And when I got there, it was clear they were both roughed up a little bit. And it was one combative was a local guy, a regular at the bar. Everybody knew him. And the other combatant was a much younger kid, college-age kid, who had unfortunately made his way from his college, which was about half an hour down the road. He was just out, I think it was a Friday night, and he clearly just wanted to go out and, mix it up a little bit. So when I walk in, they're both kind of a little disheveled, but, and the kid is, he's jawing, he's mouthing off, he's provoking this local guy. And up to that point, if I had intended to make an arrest after doing my investigation, I probably would have arrested him, because at that point, with only that limited picture in my mind, they had agreed to mix it up. They were both marked up and clothing disheveled a little bit, but he was the one mouthing off. He was the one agitating the other person and also creating general disorder in the bar. However, as I approached the two of them, I knew the local guy, and his nickname was Tub, which will give you an idea of his build. Yeah. And I told Tub, "Hey, Tub, why don't you give me a little space here? Let's get this calmed down. I'm going to talk to the kid, take him outside, and then we'll go from there." And he was agreeable with that. He's fine. And then, unfortunately, the kid came from my left peripheral and got. It seemed as though he didn't even recognize that I was there at that point. He was locked in on just giving Tub as hard a time as he could. But it was you could tell it was more of a, and I'm not sure who coined this term. I think it might have been Rory Miller, maybe Mark McYoung, but he was in a monkey dance. Yeah. And he was attempting to demonstrate, without actually being violent, attempting to demonstrate or establish his dominance over Tub. So he's at my shoulder and he starts mouthing off to Tub. And this is one of those moments where and I'm sure you've been in them yourself, where you know something's going to happen, and your body reacts to that. You get the adrenaline dump, and
Yep.
you get that little chill down your back, and it all happens. It seems to be happening in slow motion, when in fact it's only happening over a matter of a couple of seconds. But in the time it took me to put my hand on the kid's shoulder and begin pushing him backwards, Tub had hauled off and punched the kid right between the eyes. And the reason I remember this so vividly was because the kid was wearing eyeglasses, wearing metal-rimmed eyeglasses. And when Tub punched him between the eyes, he hit the kid's glasses so hard that they folded inward on themselves.
Oh, nice.
So the lenses were actually looking at each other.
Yeah.
And the kid immediately went to his knees, and now he's bloody, and the fight's over. I mean, Tub didn't have any interest in hurting the kid badly. It's just that the kid had pushed that last button, and Tub had enough of it, and that was his bar, and he was the local, and he was not going to take that shit from some out of town. I should have asked you what your policy on profanity is.
No, it's fine. You're good. As much as you like, or as little, it's all good.
Tub wasn't going to have any of that nonsense, and settled it right then and there. So when I first got to the bar, it was a situation where they were mutually combative. They were jawing at each other. At the very least, if I had to arrest anybody, it probably would have been the young kid. He was by far, the more obvious aggressor at that point. And then when I was talking to the both of them, and gotten them separated, I might have switched back to, I think we can settle this without having to take anybody to jail. I don't want to embarrass anybody in front of their friends. To, in a matter of seconds, the kid says the wrong thing, and Tub's not going to have any of that. Tub punches the kid. Well, now I have an assault. So, yeah. and that's how it went. And you might expect, if this were a TV show, you might expect that Tub was going to put up a fight, and you're not taking me anywhere. This is my bar. And he, as calmly as I had ever seen anyone, he turned his back to me, and he put his hands behind his back, and he said, "Let's go." So yeah. he actually let me put the handcuffs on him, and thank God, because Tub was one of those guys. I would have had to hit him with an ambulance to get him to go. Oh. And so it was just one of those situations where you think a situation is going to kind of work itself out, and that your mere presence there as a uniformed officer is going to settle things, but you've got to, you can't always depend on that until you actually have people in cuffs, or you have people separated and they've gone their separate ways. You've got to be ready to, you've got to be ready to respond to that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things that is, it's surprising to watch if you're not accustomed to it, where you think like, okay, well, there's a police officer on the scene standing right there. Mm-hmm. So why would you be so stupid to actually, either provoke somebody mm-hmm. or punch them right in front of a sworn officer? Because mm-hmm. that's going on record. There's no longer any way that you can ignore what happened. That's your duty. So yeah, and I've seen many of those incidents before. Go ahead.
Well, and the person, going back to your original question, a person who doesn't have any, who hasn't had any personal contact with violence, any personal experience, any firsthand experience, that encounter nobody could have anticipated how that encounter would have played itself out from the moment I walked in the door at the bar to the moment that I put the handcuffs on Tub. It wouldn't make any sense to that person, but to someone like you or me who understands, has had personal experience and understands the seemingly odd reasons that people will use violence in the first place. It may not have been predictable, but it certainly wasn't a surprise that incident that took less than 5 minutes would have taken those twists and turns. But that's the nature of social violence. It's not always going to make sense, and it's certainly not going to be intuitive to people who don't have a frame of reference.
Yeah, and I think there's a huge difference that people often don't understand between feeling justified to do something and actually being justified in the eyes of the law. It's not enough that the guy is calling you all sorts of names and or calling your mother or anybody of your family all sorts of names. You might feel justified actually punching him in the face, but that doesn't mean you are. And especially if a law enforcement officer is on the scene trying to handle what's going on, like you said, you get a call and you show up, and turns out that it's not a huge brawl you thought it was, just two guys. So like, okay, and you start working, and then all of a sudden, boom, it explodes. So
and this opens up, and not to do it now, but when the larger discussion of self-defense, even a relatively straightforward incident like this, where there weren't any, the kid was bloodied, and his nose wasn't broken, but he needed some stitches, and that notwithstanding, in terms of self-defense, there are some huge lessons to be learned there, and as far as how that situation could have been avoided in the first place. And you mentioned you might want to talk about that later on, and this is a perfect example of, it gives a perfect what's the word I'm looking for? The perfect tableau to get a couple of key lessons about self-defense across to people who are interested in preserving themselves in the face of violence or in the face of potential violence. So.
Well, I do very much like to go into that because it's one of my questions it's actually the second one on the list that I'm looking at now. But I want to get back to Tubb. So you said, you put the cuffs on him, and that's one of the things also I think there's a lot of misinformation about. What is it like when you do have to take somebody and you put the cuffs on and they go back with you, they go through the system? What's that like? If you can talk a little bit about the procedures, and I don't know if you can comment on this, but how did it end up with Tubb and his out of town friend? Anything come from that, or just like the aftermath? What it's like for a civilian to go through that? What can people expect if they mess up and do something like that?
Well, I would first and foremost, don't be Tubb, and don't be the college kid. It is going through the system, being arrested. First of all, being in a situation where violence is involved for somebody who's not inured to that, somebody who's not who has little or no experience. It's extremely unpleasant. And even if you're not injured, even if you're not hurt by the other person, it's extremely unpleasant. It makes you feel like crap. If you're in this situation, putting Tubb under arrest, the fact that he was cooperative was angel singing for me, because the thought I was prepared to do what was necessary to take him into custody because he had committed a crime, and he had committed a crime in my presence. But I couldn't afford to focus on that alone, because I also have an injured person there, and obviously the college kid was not happy with the way that things turned out, and hopefully he had a sober moment later on where he realized what a dumb shit he had been, and how he could have saved himself the stitches and what was probably a pretty expensive pair of glasses, and the embarrassment that he probably felt knowing that he got his ass kicked in front of a bar full of people. From Tubb's perspective, he had been arrested before, but in my experience, most of the people that I've arrested over the years, the strong majority of people, it was their first time. And that's speaking generically about whatever crime or whatever offense I had arrested them for. But if you've never been arrested before, it is an equally unpleasant experience. First of all, your freedom is being taken away. If you have acted in some way that requires me to arrest you, my policies and procedures as a trooper dictate that I have to take you into custody, I have to put you into handcuffs, I have to put you into my troop car, whether it's irrespective of how much violence has been involved, I have to make sure that everybody involved is now safe, which means, I called an ambulance to the scene to take care of the kid who got punched. And then once I was sure that he was going to be taken care of, he now becomes a witness to the crime that I'm arresting Tub for. So he's going to have to come back to the station at some point. I wouldn't have brought him back that night. First of all, because he was in a lot of pain, and second of all, because he was still under the influence of alcohol, so he's not going to make the best witness for me in terms of making my assault case. If I arrest you, you have to come back. You have to come back to my station. You have to go through what we generically refer to as processing. That means I'm going to take your fingerprints. I'm going to take your photograph. I'm going to make an entry about the incident that caused us to cross paths in the first place. I'm going to get medical attention for you if you need it. And then depending on the severity of the offense, I'm either going to, and this is also dependent on where in the state that you work and what other criminal justice services are available at the time. Like if I arrest somebody at 3:00 in the afternoon, I'm pretty certain I'm going to be able to find a judge to arraign that person if I need to. And by arraign, I mean that's a defendant's first appearance before a judge, and the typically judge will ask that person if they want to, if they're going to plead guilty or not guilty. It's essentially the part of the process where the court establishes its authority over a person. So in this case, even though it was much later at night, I was able to find a judge to arraign Tub, and the judge, because of the fact that he was drunk and because of the fact that he had smacked another kid pretty hard and there was blood, rather than release Tub on his own recognizance, he said, "No, you got to go to jail. Don't want to take a chance on you hurting anybody else tonight." So try to imagine, if you will, and not knowing if you've ever had to go through this process, try to imagine, if you will, being in a situation where at 11:00 at night, you're in a bar, you're surrounded by your friends, you're enjoying a good beer, you're laughing it up, maybe playing darts, shooting pool, and then 2 hours later, you're behind bars.
Yeah.
And while going from point A to point B, you had to have your fingerprints taken, you had to have your picture taken, you had to be questioned about your behavior. You might have had to call your family to come and pick you up if you were in fact going to be released, and Tub didn't have that option, as I mentioned. All of that is being taken away from you. All of the freedoms that you take for granted, the freedom to have a couple of pops with your friends in a public place, the freedom to have a discussion, have a conversation, all that's going to go away for at least a few hours, and you don't have anything to say about it. It doesn't sound like a very attractive prospect, and really that brings, I'm sure that brings us to what is at least one of the first lessons that you teach your friends and your listeners about self-defense, and that is, don't put yourself in situations where you need to exercise self-defense in the first place. The best way to win a fight is to not be there in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I really think that that's a critical thing that people need to understand, is that it's no fun. The paperwork that is involved afterward for you is quite interesting. So you're not having a great time processing all that. And at the same time, like you said, all of a sudden you're behind bars, your freedom is taken away from you. This is on record, this is on file, so there's no way that you can pretend it didn't happen. There might be consequences. Go ahead.
Along those lines, it's a matter of public record in New York.
Yeah, exactly.
If a news reporter wants to come in, and this is typical, the local news agencies and the news networks, the media, they're always looking for product, stuff that they can broadcast that's going to attract viewers and listeners, and reporting an arrest in a local bar where somebody was hurt and the police had to show up. That's from a broadcaster's perspective, that's pretty sexy. But from the person who whose life is now, or I shouldn't say life, but whose behavior is now on display for, anybody who wants to come to my station and look at my blotter, look at my records, and some, there's some information that can't be released and isn't released. But if you're talking about an adult, someone in Tubbs' situation, your life goes from being, happy and free one moment to being just having all that taken away and not having your freedom. And even though Tubb didn't have his freedom for a couple of hours, it's still unpleasant. The idea that you can't walk out the door anytime that you want to, the idea that you can't have a smoke when you want to, or get a bite to eat, or have a cup of coffee. You've made a decision to now to travel into my world, and my world can be very unpleasant for people who have been violent or been the victims of violence for that.
Exactly. And another aspect to that is, like you said, this is public record. So if you're unlucky and some reporter feels like making this a big story, it's going to be either on a reporter saying your name out loud on video that's going to be on YouTube forever. That when somebody does a Google search on your name, they're going to find those articles and videos if there are any. And if, for instance, you're looking for another job and your prospective employer does a background check, that's the first thing that's going to come up. So all of this over maybe something stupid that happens in a bar that you could have avoided by just not being an idiot about it. Just like leave everybody alone, like you said in this case. Young out-of-town kid trying to, maybe prove himself a little bit in front of a bunch of locals. It's a classic scenario that happens probably every day somewhere. Lasting consequences. It's not fun.
That's correct.
Do you have any advice for the listeners when it comes to these kinds of situations in general? Like you said, obviously stay out of it. But if you are involved in them and law enforcement gets involved, what can they do to not make it worse? What can they do to make I would say the best out of a bad situation, but at the very least, not shoot themselves in the foot?
So are we talking, the scenario that you're talking about, is that a scenario where somebody has already called the police and the police have shown up?
Yeah. So let's say the situation like you had with Tubb and the young kid is that you show up, and let's say that nothing happened just yet, but what could Tubb and the kid have done to make sure that, it doesn't get any worse? You mentioned a little bit like you were taking the approach of, okay, maybe we can settle this without anything going much further. Obviously, that kid escalated it, Tubb reacted, so it ended bad. But more generally speaking, when you arrive on the scene as a state trooper, what can people do who are involved in some sort of fight, regardless of the details we have so far, but not necessarily grievous bodily harm, but just a fight broke out, police shows up. How can they just really avoid making it really, really bad for themselves?
Well, trying to use that situation as an example, when I got there, as I mentioned, I felt like because there was no one was obviously hurt, we had some disheveled clothing and, two obvious, I wouldn't say combatants at that point because they weren't fighting when I walked in the door, but two opponents, shall we say. At that point, I had the option to either not arrest anybody, assuming there was no further combative behavior, or arresting both of them for a relatively minor offense, what the New York State Penal Law refers to as disorderly conduct. And that's essentially two people making trouble, but there's no real physical violence involved. But you're either upsetting another person, or in this case, a group of people. And at that point, they were both going to, they both could have skated with at most what we call an appearance ticket. I would have arrested them both, but it wouldn't have been, I would have taken them back to my station, but I wouldn't have had to fingerprint them. I wouldn't have had to take their pictures at that point. It would have been a relatively minor offense, akin to a traffic ticket, really.
Yeah.
However, the young man from the school. He made a decision. First of all, the first bad move was getting drunk, getting inebriated to the point that he was inebriated, because that certainly had a negative effect on his behavior, on his decision making, on his judgment. If he had not, at that moment when he said that last provocative thing to Tub, if he had just not done that, then Tub was, in my estimation, at that point, Tub was not the aggressor. He was standing there, he had his chest up, but he was not looking to mix it up more with this kid. I think he would have been just as happy going back to the bar and rejoining his friends. I interviewed a few people in the bar that night, and unfortunately the kid had walked in there on his own. He didn't have any friends from school with him, so he picked, aside from picking Tub as a guy whose skin he wanted to get under, which was a huge mistake, he was doing it in a situation where he was an army of one facing, a potential army of 10 or more, who can say. So if he had just simply kept his mouth shut. Why didn't he keep his mouth shut? Because he was caught up in the monkey dance, and also because he had had alcohol, and that was, as I mentioned, it was causing harm to his decision making process. So if he had understood in advance, and maybe this is what you're looking for, if he had understood before he ever walked out the door to go out and find a place to have a drink, if he had understood, hey, it's 11 o'clock at night, I'm going out and I'm looking for a beer. If you're looking at the clock, it's more likely you're going to get jammed up at night, especially late at night, than you might be at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a weekday. But I'm going to go out and I'm going to go out and have a beer anyway because I really want a beer. Okay, that's fine. Everything is great up to that point. But understand that once you're there, the more you drink, the more of a deleterious effect it's going to have on your decision-making process, on your judgment. The more, and everybody knows, the more they drink, the sloppier they get, the dumber they get in terms of making decisions. And if you just understand in advance what the possible consequences are, maybe that's enough. It's not that you shouldn't go out and have a pop at all. Nobody's saying that you should never do anything that might put you in harm's way. I mean, life is all about managing risk from day to day, but understand how things can go bad. Understand that having 4 beers in an hour is exponentially dumber, and self-defeating than going out and having 1 or 2 beers in that same hour. Beyond that, understand that you're walking into a bar that you're not familiar with, and you're just going there to have a beer. Keep a low profile. Have your beer. Strike up a friendly conversation with some of the other folks there. Hey, this is a nice place. How long have you been coming here? What's there to do in town? Have a civil conversation. If you choose not to do that, then you are exponentially increasing your chances of getting into some shit. So the simplest thing to do is understand in advance what the potential consequences are of your decisions, and then with that in mind, make good decisions. Make a series of good decisions, and if you make a bad one, don't follow it up with another bad one. So now you've made a bad decision. This kid's decided to mix it up with a local. Now the trooper's here. The trooper's looking to arrest somebody or, fix the problem, whatever that may be. The last thing you want to do is mouth off to the other guy in front of the trooper and get in his face, get into his personal space. Most people, sober or drunk, don't react well to that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think that's excellent advice. No, it totally makes sense. And for the young people, I'll share this quick little story. When I was 18, my mom gave me this really small statue to put on my desk. Or to do whatever I want with it, because she didn't really talk much. She said, "Here's this for you," and it's the 3 monkeys, hear no evil, see no evil, and so on.
Sure.
right? And there's a fourth one. He's got his hand. The other ones have their hands on their eyes, their ears, their mouth, and so on. And the fourth one has his hand in front of his groin. So, and I always like that from my mom. It's like, look, just keep this kind of stuff in mind when you go out into the world. And if you can rein yourself back in all these 4 departments, maybe you can stay out of trouble and lead a good life. So I just wanted to attach that to what you just said, is that just make smart decisions and don't put yourself in a situation where it's very difficult to avoid making a stupid decision. Getting rip-roaring drunk in the bar like that, it's like, it's not going to end well.
Some people ought to be carrying that statue in their pockets, Wim.
I might make a T-shirt out of that. 4 rules of self-defense, and then just put that on a T-shirt. Okay, I think we're at about the 50-minute mark now. I just wanted to ask you a couple more questions, John, from one of my patrons, D, and he had 4 questions for you. If you can answer that, I'll shoot you the first one. He asked, what are the biggest challenges facing LEOs, law enforcement officers, with policing in modern times? And are there things that we as civilians can do or should know in order to not add to the burden?
Oh, those are really good questions. So do you think, should we go at this from, when you're asking about challenges, do you think he's thinking challenges to officers as individual law enforcement officers, or to the police, to the police community in general?
I think more in general. That's my sense of it.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Wow. And it's how much time do you have? I would say at or near the top of the list. From a strictly law enforcement perspective would be domestic terrorism. Right now, we are the criminal justice community is. This is a problem around the world, as you well know, and it has hit just as close to you at home as it has me. In addressing domestic terrorism, traditional police agencies, whether they are state, county, or local, until maybe 20 years ago, this was not terrorism. First of all, terrorism was not something that a typical police agency might have to deal with on a frequent basis anyway. Much less domestic terrorism. However, as the years have passed, domestic terrorism has become much more of a problem. Again, not only in the United States but around the world. Where the terrorists themselves, they're not coming from another country to pursue their mission of terrorism, and that has created, aside from the fact that police agencies in this country and elsewhere do have to be part of the response picture to terrorism. In attempting to fulfill that role, agencies have had to adopt a new mission, have had to adopt new tactics, have had to invest in types of equipment that previously weren't part of our inventory. And so you see, when you have a terrorist incident now, the police, instead of showing up in their traditional patrol cars, their sedans and their SUVs and whatever the case, now they're showing up in Bearcats. Now they're showing up in vehicles and wearing equipment that was previously associated with the military.
Yeah.
And while the reasons for the police agencies adopting this equipment and adopting these tactics is for a good cause, self-preservation and the preservation of innocent life, unfortunately, it also creates a public perception that police agencies are now becoming they have almost a military mission now, and that's hard. From my perspective, from a police officer's perspective, that is that's a hard argument to have. It's a hard situation to deal with, because you understand the need to have this higher tech equipment, this more military looking equipment, because it serves a specific purpose. But we also have to deal with that, with that negative public perception, and that's a whole separate battle. And it's a battle that needs to be fought. It's a discussion that needs to be had, because we're accountable to the public that we serve. And it's our job to, if we feel that we have to adopt these tactics and this equipment for a legitimate purpose, then we need to be accountable for that, and try to strive to make the public understand that it's not about trying to take away people's rights, more effectively. It's about trying to preserve life and preserve property more effectively. So.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with you on that, and just like you just mentioned, type of equipment and more of a military style of law enforcement, perhaps. I remember back in the day, and this is at least 10, maybe 15 years ago, when the first reports on the news started coming out, when people said, the police is using equipment that's coming straight from the army in Iraq. That they're bringing back, they're buying all these kind of things, they don't need that. And I was like, I don't think everybody's been paying attention, because it's the dangers, the threats out there are changing. And they've been changing for a long time, and we've had ample warning, but nobody wanted to hear it. And one of the best books that I know of is out there. It's called Modern Warfare, and I'll put a link in the show notes. It's a French view of counterinsurgency by Roger Trinquier. And he talks about his experience in Indochina, and this is actually, when you read it, you might disagree with some of the things that are in there, obviously, and I know I do. For instance, when it comes to torture and other things that he writes about, but he very much predicts today's society when it comes to homegrown terrorism. That book was written in 1961.
This goes.
And it's been.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Well, and my point is that this kind of thing has been on the horizon for such a long time, and now it's here. And the 2-year anniversary of the Brussels attacks is coming up, and people still think like, well, it's no big deal, it's going to go away, and everything's fine. I'm like, I'm just waiting for the next one to happen. That's what I'm doing.
Well, I regrettably I have to agree with you. And this whole vein of discussion goes back to one of the very first points that you made at the top of the podcast, and that is that the idea that if you haven't had personal experience with violence, if you haven't been touched by it in an intimate way, either yourself or a family member or somebody you love, you don't have a frame of reference, and frankly, you don't have a broad enough and educated enough perspective to make an emotional appeal that this kind, these tactics that the police have had to adopt, and the so-called military equipment that we have to use, that there's a need for that. It's easy to speak and try to argue from emotion that that the police has now become over militarized, or that the steps that that police agencies are taking to try and thwart domestic terrorism aren't necessary, because you don't you see those things as a threat to your freedom. But if you haven't experienced the terrorism firsthand and what that can mean, then all you're doing is speaking from emotion. You're not speaking from a position of logic or even from experience. And unfortunately, we need far more people acknowledging the fact that there is a need for this, and as you say, the need is not going away, and that things may in fact get a lot worse before they get better, and it's probably a war, a conflict that we're going to be a part of long after you and I have left the earth, my friend.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I've written about this in the past, and it's one of the things that I feel is a lot of sound discussion on this, and just being very realistic about homegrown terrorism or domestic terrorism. It's very much missing in the mainstream media. What I see a lot is just trying to skirt the issue, and I've seen this here in Belgium a few years before the actual attacks happened. That somebody was actually warning, like, look, this is getting out of hand. We will have terror attacks here. Mm-hmm. And the show host just literally said, like, you're scaring people. And it says they should be scared. And then they just switch to somebody else, like, no, we can't say this out loud. Oh. And that ostrich syndrome of just ramming your head into the ground. Yeah. And I was like, yeah, exactly. Go ahead.
No, I that is that's the antithesis of the lesson that you're trying to get out. And the idea that the single best way in this world we live in now, the single best way to get any message out, positive, negative, or neutral, to the broadest spectrum of people, to the greatest population of people, is the mass media. And when you're in a situation like that, and I've done a number of interviews over the years. And I've been in situations, I've been in interviews where, I was told that certain questions were going to be asked, and, they wanted frankness, and they wanted candor, and they didn't want anything sugar-coated. And then once you start providing that, they suddenly decide, oh no, our viewership or our listeners, they're too sensitive. Yeah. We can't go with this because, and what's frustrating to me is that it has seemed to me like the reason for wanting to cut off that line of discussion has been because the reporter or the media representative was afraid of losing listeners or afraid of losing viewers. And unfortunately, it's a lesson that you often have to learn over and over again, that the good intentions may be there, at least at the outset, but it's the economy of it. It's the desire to maximize profit by maximizing the number of listeners, the number of viewers, takes precedence over getting what is unfortunately a stark message out, but one that it has benefits in the long term, because it can help people at least think about how to make themselves safer.
Yeah, and I think I call this the Disneyfication of society. Mm-hmm. Is that everything's puppy and rainbows, and no matter what bad thing happens, eventually good will prevail. Mm. That's not really how the world works, but that's what people only want to hear nowadays. And the reason why I use Disneyfication is that they took all the old stories from old Europe, all the fairy tales, and made them into beautiful stories of victory of good over evil. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the original stories, they were very dark. They were warnings. Yeah, they were meant to scare you into not doing stupid stuff.
Yeah, the Brothers Grimm.
Little Red Riding. Go ahead. Yeah, exactly. That was Grimm.
Grimm leaps to mind immediately. Yeah.
Yeah, Little Red Riding Hood. Mm-hmm. Don't go in the forest that night. Just don't do it. Mm-hmm. Bad things happen. Why, Mom? Well, because there's a big bad wolf. Oh, okay, I won't go. Done.
Mm-hmm. Not very interesting.
And that's the way. No, you go ahead first, John.
Okay, not very interesting, but you do come out alive at the end of it.
Exactly. All right. Well, I'd like to go to the second question that Dee asked. What advice can you give civilians in how to act when being pulled over?
Let's see. This is simple, but it's also hard. It is, if it happens, then understand that it has happened for a reason. And I'll speak specifically of the laws governing the behavior of police officers in New York State. We can't pull you over for no reason. It's a violation of the United States Constitution. It's a violation of the state constitution. It's a violation of a couple of different chapters of state law. If you're pulled over, it's for a reason. And let me preface all of this by saying that the profession of police officer, the profession of law enforcement officer, as a profession has, like every other profession, has what we call, or what I call, the 5%ers. And the 5%ers are a group of individuals who, through their behavior, make life difficult for the other 95%. The simple way of saying that is we have our share of assholes, just like everybody else does.
Yeah, true.
But in the vast majority, and that's the place from where my reply will come. If you're pulled over, you were pulled over for a reason. You either violated some traffic law, or perhaps the officer who observed you saw that you were weaving in your lane, for example. So when I have done that, when it's been 2:00 in the morning and somebody's driving in front of me and they're weaving in their lane, yeah, as a cop, my first thought is probably, I wonder if this person's had too much to drink or is under the influence of drugs. But there are other possibilities. And so when I pull that car over, and this is something that I've told just about everybody who's asked me the same question you just did over the years, I am there to preserve safety, whether it's your safety or the safety of people near you, the safety of the motoring public, or my own safety. That's my primary focus. So I'm pulling you over not just in the hope of writing you a ticket or arresting you for some more serious crime. I am pulling you over because I'm concerned for safety, yours and everybody else's. If you're driving down that road at 2 in the morning and you're weaving in and out of your lane, you might hit somebody else. You might drive off the road yourself and be injured. I'm trying to prevent that. So that being said, if you pull over and I pull in behind you, the smartest thing you can do is be an adult. We're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask you probably where you're coming from and where you're going. I'm going to ask you why. And I'm allowed to ask these questions as someone who's trying to preserve public safety and public order. If you're the kind of person who reacts to questions like that by getting your back up, and if you're one of those folks who's saying, who's thinking to yourself, you can't tell me what to do, the conversation, first of all, is going to be far more unpleasant than it needs to be, and it's not going to go your way. If I've stopped you for a reason and you're making it impossible for me to determine if there is a problem, whether there's been some offense of law, or rather if you have had too much to drink, and you resist me verbally and otherwise, it's not going to go your way. So lesson 1 is, please be an adult. Be the adult that you've probably been for many years now. Acknowledge that you've been stopped for a reason. If you have to argue, then please follow my instructions. Make sure I can see your hands at all times. Don't make any sudden moves. Respond to my questions as I'm asking them. Stay in your car unless I ask you to get out of it, because now, depending on where I've stopped you and the time of day, there could be a lot of traffic blowing by us at high speed, and I don't want to get whacked by somebody any more than you do. I've created a situation that because of my job, I have to be in control of. I have to maintain control of. Help me do that.
That's a really good answer. I think that's. I wish more people followed it. I certainly wish more people would follow it.
I'm fortunate. I haven't had to make. I've made a couple of traffic stops as a supervisor over the years, but I haven't had to make traffic stops in bunches for many years now. And to be honest, the vast majority of those stops went pretty much the way I just described. And in the vast majority of those cases, I mean, if I had to issue a ticket, I would do that, but we would have a civil conversation. I would explain to you why you were getting the ticket, why you were stopped in the first place. I would identify myself, all of which we are required as troopers to do. So try to make the process as cooperative as possible, as opposed to adversarial.
Yeah. All right. I've got 2 more questions for you from Dee, and third one is this. What is the first lesson you would teach a new police officer who is about to start patrolling the streets?
All right. Let me preface this by saying that the nature of our job requires us to investigate things, whether it's investigate crimes, whether it's to investigate reported crimes, whether it's to investigate things that appear to us to be out of the ordinary and where there might be, where there might be something wrong. Okay. So lesson 1 for me, if I'm breaking in a new trooper, is everybody lies.
Yep.
Let me explain that.
I don't know. I get it, but go ahead.
I'm sure, and I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. First of all, if you're a bad guy or a bad girl, as the case may be, you're going to lie to me, and I know that because as the career path you've chosen for yourself, part of your modus operandi is to lie to people, whether it's to get something from another person that you want, whether it's to avoid prosecution. That's going to happen. But in a much more innocuous situation, let's say I have to go to a 2-car automobile accident, and it's at a fairly busy intersection. And in addition to the 2 drivers who've been involved in the accident, I have, let's say, 5 or 6 other witnesses who claim to have seen what happened. So I go to the scene. I checked as a sick public safety professional. I check to see if anybody needs immediate medical care. I need to make sure that I call an ambulance if that's the case. I need to make arrangements to get the vehicles out of traffic so that there are no secondary crashes. You see where I'm going with this. So after all that's done and I've preserved public order and public safety, now I have to investigate the crash. So I talk to the 2 drivers. And because I wasn't a witness to the crash, I have only what little evidence there is at the scene and their testimony, at the time, what they're telling me to determine what happened. So let's say there's a difference of opinion as to who's at fault. So I get one story from the first driver that I speak to, and then I take the other driver out of earshot to talk to them, and I get a different story. It's not uncommon. I'm going to, after I've gotten their stories and taken my notes and all that good stuff, now I'm going to go talk to the witnesses. I talked to 4 different witnesses. How many different stories do you think I'm going to get, Wim?
Yeah, at the very least 4.
Exactly. And we're talking about 4 people who weren't involved in the accident themselves. They may not have anything to do, have any acquaintance with the drivers themselves, but they all have their own unique perspectives as to what happened. Even though there is a truth to how things happened, truth takes on 4 different meanings when I talk to those 4 witnesses. So it's my job, and I'm explaining this to my new trooper. It's going to be your job, trooper, to try and sift through those stories, find the commonalities, find the differences, explore what you can, and then make a judgment as to whether somebody has to get a ticket or whether both people have to get a ticket, and so on. Now, this is kind of the process that a new trooper is going to go through regardless of what incident they're investigating, whether it's a car crash, whether it's a domestic violence incident, whether it's an assault in a bar like the one we were talking about earlier. No matter who you talk to, you're going to get different stories. whether the person you're speaking to is intentionally lying or is really just trying to tell you, is just trying to be helpful. Even in trying to be helpful, people can misrepresent what actually happened because they are human. So,
yeah, I'd like to emphasize that point. It's one of the things that is also very counterintuitive, is that just because you saw it doesn't mean it's true.
mm-hmm.
There's all sorts of ways you might misinterpret or only see because of the angle, your viewing angle. You don't see certain aspects of the incident that completely skews your look on what happened.
Exactly, and beyond that, if we're talking about perception, what we perceive as individuals is shaped in part by who we are. The life that we've lived up to that point, the experiences that we've had, the things good and bad that we've been exposed to. That is, the human mind, for all of its amazing abilities to remember things and to associate things. We're still human, and there are still, we're still flawed. We misremember things, even when it's not not intentional. And so that's something that as an investigator of an incident, I have to take into account. And that's why you try to find, when you're talking to multiple witnesses, you're trying to find commonalities, but you're also trying to find out where they are, where their stories deviate from each other, and that can, more often than not, that can help make an investigation more successful.
Yeah. Okay, excellent.
Okay.
Excellent. Yep. I've got one more, if you still have some time left.
Shoot. Absolutely.
Okay. Can you recommend any books that do a good job of giving you an insight into what the life of a Leo is actually like, of a law enforcement officer? That's the last question Dee asked. Any books you would recommend?
Any books? Well, let's see. And let me just preface this by saying that I will recommend them. I'm not a book critic, and the couple that I'm thinking of will present, I think, slightly different authors' perspectives on the job of being a law enforcement officer. I know that there's a gentleman by the name of Carl Vick, Karl, last name is Vick, and he did a piece. I'm pretty sure he wrote a book, and that it was excerpted in Time magazine, and I can't recall how long ago. It might have been as much as a decade, but he did a piece after interviewing, I want to say, well, it was more than 500. It may have been as many as 1,000 officers with the Philadelphia Police Department. And Philadelphia is, I believe it's the largest city in the state of Pennsylvania, which is immediately south of New York State. And Philadelphia has a very active police department, and it has a very interesting and sometimes spotted history. There's been a lot of civil unrest in the city of Philadelphia over the years, and Mr. Vick's piece. It's based on interviews with the officers themselves, so that could give someone who's not in the profession an idea of what it's like, at least to be a police officer in a large metropolitan city.
I think I found one here, and it's called "What's It Like Being a Cop" by Carl Vick.
That's it. That's one.
I think Time magazine issued that out, and I'll see if I can find a link to that and to put it in the show notes for Dee and everybody else.
Okay. All right.
I hadn't heard about that. That looks like it's really interesting.
Yeah, it won't. And again, just a proviso. It won't tell you. It'll give you a good. It can give the uninitiated a good perspective on being a city cop and on the challenges of being a law enforcement officer in general. As I mentioned earlier, the kind of activities that a cop in a big city like Philadelphia goes through day to day will differ substantially from what a state trooper in a rural area or a sheriff's deputy or even a police officer from a small village might encounter from day to day, even though we're enforcing essentially the same laws. So
Yeah. Okay.
there's another gentleman, and this guy is he was a police officer. He's retired now, and he was a SWAT operator on his department for several years too. His name is Dan, and I hope I'll pronounce the last name right. I can certainly spell it. It's Marcou. It's Marcou. And Dan wrote a book, I believe it was called The Calling. And that's going back several years, but still topical. And that gives you, I remember finding a lot of commonality in that book, and I enjoy Dan's writing. He's not a professional writer and a professional author. Well, I shouldn't say that. He is a professional author now, but he writes in cops' language, so you can understand. You can understand our lexicon and some of the some of the unique phrases and words that we use in this profession.
Yeah.
Let's see. The other guy who always leaps to mind, and I know he's a good friend of yours, is Lauren Christensen.
Yeah.
And Lauren's book. I mean, he's written both nonfiction and fiction books from the cops' perspective, or with cops as the protagonist. He was an MP, a military policeman for the United States Army in Vietnam, going back to the mid to late 60s. And then he was an officer, and I think also a supervisor, and also a plainclothes officer for a major city in the
in Portland.
Yeah, Pacific Northwest. Yep, of the United States. Lauren's written a lot of, and he's got a great sense of humor. He's written a lot of great stuff. I can't think of any one book in particular that I'd recommend. I have found them. I've read 5 or 6 of his pieces at least, and found them all interesting. So.
There's a bunch of them, and he's actually just started a fun new short story collection called Boss, about an old school police officer. And it's quite good. Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. Yeah, he's written a lot of stuff about his work. I'm just going through his Amazon list because he's got 50 plus books out there.
Yeah. And he's a guy who walks the walk, or has walked the walk, and he's obviously got a strong, lifelong martial arts background. I really like he's got a very self-effacing sense of humor. I've never spoken to him personally. We've corresponded briefly a couple of times over the years, but just having read interviews that he's done and having read the works that he's written himself, he's easy to read because he can take himself seriously and he can take his job seriously, but he manages not to do both at the same time.
Yeah, and obviously, as many of and many listeners do know, Lauren is my mentor. It's mainly thanks to him that I'm writing books now, and he helped me just get started, and the videos with Paladin Press, it's all thanks to him. Yeah. We're still in touch, obviously. One of the best, and just talking about his police work, one of the best things that ever happened in my life, it was just an awesome experience, is when I first visited him in Portland, and he just took me to downtown, and he wrote a book, and I'll see if I can find it and put a link in there. It's called Skid Row Beat. Which is what Skid Row was like. It was not just a place, but also a mindset and the kind of things you found there. Mm-hmm. It's just the really seedy underbelly of society. And he worked there as a beat cop, and we drove through the streets that he used to patrol, and said, and we'd cruise, and he'd say, well, one time I had a call and this happened, and we drive for 30 seconds. He says, oh, over there I had another call and this happened, and I got to hear all the stories live. That was quite an experience, and it was a lot of fun. And I can also recommend,
isn't it? It's very eye-opening.
Oh yeah, a lot of people have really no idea the kind of thing that happens in society. just once you scrape the underneath the surface, there's things going on there that nobody. And then we get back to the whole part of people not having experience with violence, but also certain strata of society. And I quickly want to mention another book of his. It's called Crouching Tiger, Taming the Warrior Within, and that's basically a memoir that he wrote. And it's just a really interesting book with a bunch of little vignette stories that he experienced as a martial artist, as an MP in Vietnam, as a police officer, and just gives you a sense of the kind of things that you experience. And I think you would really enjoy that book as well. I think it'll resonate with a lot of your experiences as well.
Yeah, I'm going to check that out. It's funny, as a cop myself, the stuff of Lauren's that I've read over the years has been more martial arts or combatives oriented, just because I've tried over the years to minimize my toolbox and to try to develop tools, just a few tools that work in most situations if I've needed to use force. And so the two, I remember he did a couple of books. In fact, they're still in my library on solo training. And and the other one that I got a lot of was actually a book that I believe you co-wrote with him called Timing in the Martial Arts, which I also found very useful, very interesting.
Yeah, we wrote that one together. Yeah.
Good stuff.
I'm glad to hear that you liked it.
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's all the questions I have. I'm just watching the time here. We're closing in on the 90-minute mark, so that's I think we covered a bunch of ground here. Yeah. I really hope that the listeners, got a good sense of what it's like. Not just in law enforcement in general, but the work of a state trooper. And I think you gave some excellent advice along the way. Any parting words, Jon, that you want to leave the listeners with?
Boy, well, first of all, I want to thank your listeners for having the good sense to listen to your podcasts and to follow you. I've enjoyed reading your work in mostly in bits and pieces over the years, and if they're listening to you, then they're going to be the better for it. I know that we didn't get a chance to talk too much about domestic violence per se, but I'll just talk about that in the future. Or if you get some questions from listeners regarding domestic violence, if I think I can answer them, I'm happy to do that. And
well, I was thinking, and it was just because of time constraints that I skipped those questions. But I think we can, in the future, I would love to have you back on the show and make that like the main topic that we discussed then, or one of the main topics, because it's one of those topics, domestic violence. Again, a lot of misinformation, a lot of myths out there, lots of Hollywood stuff that people think is actually the way it always goes. And I would love to hear your perspective and obviously, from your experience, your professional experience handling those kinds of cases, just so we can dispel some more of the misinformation, and so that listeners have more, functional knowledge that they can use to stay out of those situations or handle them correctly. But maybe we can do that sometime in the future.
Okay, that sounds like it. That sounds like it'd be an interesting conversation. And
I'm looking forward to it already.
And lastly, I thank you very much for your time. I hope that your listeners found at least some of this worthwhile and pertinent to what they're living.
Well, I think they will, and I truly hope so. And I want to thank you for your time, Jon. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, as you well know. But also, I'm always grateful when people that I've known for a long time, and I know to be professionals, just willing to share their experience and share their views, because that's one of the few ways that I know that we can get this information out there if people like you are willing to talk about it. And that's why from my end, I'm very appreciative of that fact that you're willing to do that. So I think I think everybody will be able to get something out of this. And with that said, I'm gonna close out this episode. I want to thank all the listeners for listening to us talk. And if you have any questions, obviously you can contact me on the blog or on Facebook or wherever. All the links, all the stuff that we talked about, I will make that available in the show notes. You can see that on my blog or in the description in whatever app you use to listen to the episodes here of my podcast. You obviously like, share, subscribe if you can, and you can always join me on Patreon if you'd like to support the show and get even more content. And with that said, thank you very much, and I will talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wimsblog.com.